Welcome, everyone. I'm Nava Vogel, for anybody who doesn't know me, the director of the Council on Aging here, and I'm so delighted that to bring you Professor Charlotte Eichels, who is a friend and longtime colleague, and we've known each other for over 30 years at this point. Charlotte is a gerontologist and a China expert. She's professor emerita, Case University.
West Reserve.
West Reserve, thank you. And has written several award-winning books on China.
Oh, how interesting.
And she's a birder, which many of you are. And
Going to Portugal.
yes, among her many skills and virtues, Charlotte speaks Mandarin and Cantonese and did much of her early work in Hong Kong and Canton. So I'm delighted that she'll be speaking with you about critical issues in China today. I know many of you are very interested and concerned about this major country in the world, and thank you very much, Charlotte. It's welcome.
All right, thank you. I hope I've chosen topics that will be of interest. There are so many topics one could discuss on China that it's sort of endless. So you'll have to forgive me if I have chosen topics that I hope are of interest to you, but are especially of interest to me, since I'm more prepared to talk on topics that I've actually done some work on. Now, the first topic that I'd like to talk about is the situation in the environment in China. I know a lot of you are concerned about U.S.-Chinese relations, and I will get to that at the end. But what I want to do is kind of correct what I see as a serious imbalance in presentations about China in the U.S. And that is that we're very much aware of, a rising China and an aggressive China and this kind of thing. And we kind of ignore the fact that while much of this is true, China has certainly grown enormously, particularly in the last 20 years, it has serious domestic problems that at any time could cause financial, economic, and to some extent even political problems. And with these kinds of issues in China's background, they can't devote all of their energy to international affairs or expanding their sphere of influence. They have to think very much about how do we keep our own situation, stable, how do we keep the population happy, might be too strong a word, but prosperous, certainly. So I thought I would start with something that does actually get coverage in the US, and that is China's environmental degradation. You also tend to hear, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, of course, on what the nature of this degradation is, but many people associate it almost exclusively with the past 35 years of development, 30 to 35 years of development. In fact, much of China's environmental difficulties go way, way back. These are related to climate issues, population pressure, and so forth, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So one of the first things we need to know is the layout of China. Everybody's got a map, I hope. China broadly, North China, South China, enormous differences in water availability. As population pressure built, China, particularly in the Northwest, began to move into area that really was not sustainable. You could not really have sustainable agriculture solely with counting on rainfall. You needed to do irrigation. And China very early on developed tremendous irrigation networks along the Yellow River, which basically runs through this area, the Yellow River, south of Beijing, pretty far north of Shanghai, so through this area. So the Yellow River for a long time has been a source of irrigation for much of China. But, so it's an ongoing problem with population pressure forcing agriculture to move into less sustainable areas. More recently, during the Maoist era, roughly 1949 to 1976, Mao took a very strong stance on development. He was very big on the idea that human labor power is very important and can achieve almost unbelievable ends when properly motivated. He had demonstrated this in a number of projects that were carried out on a small scale, but in 1958 he began this project known as the Great Leap Forward. The idea of the Great Leap was that economic development would develop very rapidly and even overtake England eventually, England being the target country at that time. Unfortunately, this was an ideologically driven and not a scientifically driven kind of policy decision. It led to crazy things like the deeper you dig, the better it is for the seeds, and they dug right down into sterile levels of the soil. Guess what? If it's a sterile level, it's not going to, your seeds are not going to grow. He also had everybody melt down any piece of metal they didn't use, your wok, because for a while they had communal cooking, so you did not need private household utensils. Your wok, anything else that was metal was supposed to be thrown into a backyard furnace that would generate steel. So this is an era of backyard steel furnaces. Well, could you get the temperature high enough? Did everybody know how to do this? No. So it was a real disaster from the point of view of wasted metal. It was a real disaster in terms of crop failure. Estimates vary, but very rapidly it became clear that bad agricultural decisions had been made, partly based on the fact that local officials felt that it would be a mistake to say they weren't doing well. So you said, sure, Mao's right, we doubled, tripled, quadrupled, quintupled yields. And they would, when an inspection team came by, they would have these huge piles of grain that were probably from 50 fields and say, we got this from 5 fields. And they would get a little medal for that. But that was very misleading for Beijing. Beijing thought, wow, we're successful, we're getting all of this grain. So they upped the quota that they could take for tax purposes and for paying back loans to the Soviet Union and so forth. And guess what? There was no grain left in the granaries. Figures vary, but a middling figure for the number of people who died as a result of this famine that occurred from 60 to 62 is on the order of 30 million people. That's a big mistake for a great leap forward. So things were already, and obviously also this was destructive of the soil. Many dams were built at the same time, and these dams were, again, collapsing right and left. So it wasn't simply since the economic reform period of the early 1980s to the present that got China into its fix. There's been a long history of we want to conquer nature. I mean, you read Taoist poetry and so forth, and you think they love nature, they would never do anything. That's a piece, but that's very different from looking at what's actually happening on the ground. Okay, so let's look specifically at some of the issues. Soil or land. Tremendous deforestation. China currently is, I think, the largest importer of lumber from outside of China because they have, frankly, very little wood. Very little wood. That means they have very few trees. That means there's not much to hold the soil back. This means two things, depending on the larger climate in the immediate area. One is it leads to wind-swept soil going all over the place. And some of you may have read about these dust storms that come swirling in on Beijing. These are from the desert, which is now, I don't know what, like 70 miles west of Beijing. The desert is just encroaching and encroaching and encroaching. So a very difficult situation there. The second great problem is where there's a lot of rainfall and you're not holding the soil, the rain is going to wash the soil away. This is going to promote flooding, silting, and so forth. So deforestation has been a major problem. There have been, I mean, the government has responded to this. It's not like they don't know what's going on. And they have periodically at the provincial level instituted replanting campaigns. But again, it's the sort of thing, actually I see this in Cambridge next door. They plant a tree and who's going to water it? Some good-natured soul. Well, not in Cambridge. Those trees all die the next year. I belong to Green Cambridge, so we're trying to get the trees to grow. But China has got the same problem. They will put up, you'll go by someplace and you'll see, you know, middle school students out there planting these cute little trees about yay big, about this far apart. Well, what's the future for little trees growing this far apart? Not good. Plus, they don't water them. So it's again, it's a lot of wasted effort. It shows intention, but the follow-through at the local level is frequently not what you would want. So we have deforestation leading to flooding, leading to sandstorms. Desertification, that's turning the land into deserts. I've sort of already covered that. And there's also salinization. I'm not even sure that's a real word, but this is causing the soil to become more salty from a variety of different reasons. But when the soil becomes salty, it will basically only grow salt-loving plants, which are not the normal agricultural plants that people would want to be planting. So you're taking a lot of land out of agriculture at the very same time that your population is growing and the desert is taking land away. So they're in a bit of a mess when you come to looking at the agricultural situation. And there's more mess, which I'll come to shortly. All right, so land is a problem, and land utilization and preservation are both problems. Water. Rainfall varies enormously across China. I mean, if you have a desert, that suggests there must be regions of China with very little rainfall, and that is true. This whole area is practically desert. Practically. There are oases. I'm sorry. This whole area is practically desert. This area has oases, so it can produce agriculture, you know, palms and whatnot, dates, in certain areas. But other than that, it's largely desert. The south, on the other hand, gets lots and lots of rain. So problems vary depending on what part of China you're from. And just to give you a vivid illustration, in 1998, I was actually carrying out research in Guangzhou, which is this city just north of Hong Kong. And it's a very wet area. And I was flying from Guangzhou to Beijing. In the course of flying from Guangzhou to Beijing, I flew over the two biggest rivers in China, the Yangtze, which comes along here, and the Yellow, which I mentioned earlier, and that's up this way. So Yangtze is running through heavy-duty rainfall country. The Yellow River is running through, essentially, in most parts, basically a desert atmosphere. So, 1998, I'm flying. I look down on the Yangtze. It's in flood stage. Over 3,000 people, I think 3,300 people died in flooding of the Yangtze River that year. And it was covered very, yes?
Excuse my interruption. Do we say Yangtze?
We do, but I'm using the Chinese, Yangtze. Sorry, yeah, it's the same place. Yeah, but it's the same place. It was covered very much on national TV in China, but the coverage was how few people were killed. Only 3,300 people were killed, which gives you some idea of the magnitude of flood damage that China has undergone before. There have been very, very serious floods. I kept on going. It was my little airplane ride, and I was excited, I thought, to see the Yellow River, but I missed it. I mean, it was clear. How could you miss it? You know, you think I'm picturing this yellow ribbon, you know, going through the landscape, and it wasn't there. And I thought, you know, I must have blinked or something. I'll catch it on the way back. Okay, so now I'm flying back from Beijing, and I look down at what must have been a river valley. It was dry as a bone. I thought, how can that be? How can the Yellow River be gone? This doesn't make sense. The next year, I was attending the Association for Asian Studies conference, and somebody was giving a paper on the Yellow River. And I thought, gotta go. So I went, and it turns out the Yellow River, for several years in the 1990s, didn't make it to the sea. So it was correct. There was no Yellow River there. It ran short 70 miles upstream. Well, how could it run short? Well, people upstream were using it for irrigation, for power generation, for consumption, consumer consumption domestically in cities. And, you know, I want mine, and then you get yours, and then you don't get anything. So they really needed to get some coordination going so that this problem did not continue. Also, of course, people upstream are taking water and then dumping the bad stuff in the water for the next group down. So the Yellow River was a real mess. So both the Yellow River, the Yangtze, and a number of major Southeast Asian rivers like the Mekong draw their water, their primary water, from the mountains in Tibet, from melting glaciers, from annual snowfalls, and so forth. Well, folks, whether you believe it or not, it's warming up out there. Glaciers are melting. The snowfall has gone down. And these rivers are under threat, not of drying up to the extent of the Yellow River in the 1990s, but eventually this is going to be a very serious problem. At the same time, both Southeast Asian countries and China in that region are very interested in generating more hydroelectric power. I mean, they don't have to irrigate so much in that area because that's a high rainfall area. But they're interested in power and building dams. So that's a lot of money, that's a lot of political hassle, both domestically, one province arguing with another, and certainly internationally with Vietnam, Cambodia, Burma, and so forth. So all kinds of problems. Because of the water shortage in the rivers, China has, particularly North China, has relied increasingly on water from the ground, groundwater. Well, the groundwater level is going down, down, down. You try to sink a well, you got to really, really go down. And as you suck that water out from these millions of wells, the ground falls too. So there are these problems of subsidence, buildings being unstable, and so forth. So lots to worry about if you're the Chinese government. And then last, but certainly not least, is the incredible pollution of the water. I have a book which I didn't bring here called The River Runs Black. This is not the Yangtze and it's not the Yellow, it's the Huai River, Huai, which is a major tributary to the Yangtze, but north of the Yangtze comes down. Dye, industry, I can't think of the right word in English, agriculture, make it richer, fertilizer, excess pesticide. They've gone overboard. We've got all these great chemical things, let's use them. And very little sense of balance. So it's been a very difficult situation. The rivers are too polluted. Everybody's using bottled water. The question for me is, where is the water in the bottled water coming from? Yeah. I mean, I don't know, but that's what everybody's drinking. No tap water, please. You can shower, but not everywhere. So quite difficult. All right, air pollution. Terrible. I was in Beijing in 2015 for 6 weeks, October, November. And everybody this side of the Pacific was saying, oh my gosh, aren't you scared? Aren't you going to choke to death? And so on and so forth. Actually, no. It wasn't until our very last week there that we began to realize the air pollution is really, really very bad. And the reason for this is that it's cold up there, but most places are not allowed to use coal for heat until, I've forgotten, like November 15th. That may be not the right date, but it's somewhere around there. And then suddenly, the heat's turned on. I mean, we were freezing. People finally got us little space heaters so we wouldn't freeze to death. Because, I mean, this is Beijing in November, no heat. So when the cold comes, when it's time to turn the heat on and the cold goes, the city, where is it? It starts to disappear. And there were some really frightening statistics, which I can scare you with here. Certain small, tiny, breathable particles are what's really bad for you because they stick in your lung and so forth. Some of these bigger things, like dust from construction, it's unpleasant. It causes pollution. It dirties your TV screen, your camera. You can't see. But that's not the dust that's going to get into your lungs and cause you serious problems. All right. Official maximum is 35 micrograms per cubic meter. This is what's considered, it's still healthy, up to 35 micrograms of these small particles per cubic meter. This year, in January and February of Beijing, the average was 95 micrograms per cubic meter. That's a lot more than the maximum considered healthful. And there was a lot of concern on the part of the Olympic Committee that the atmosphere would be too terrible. I mean, that this would be unhealthy for the athletes. So could Beijing do anything about this? Well, first of all, they didn't hold the games in the winter. So that's a big step. You're away from a lot of the coal. But they developed all kinds of things. They halved the number of cars on the street. Odd-numbered cars, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Even-numbered cars, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. Just half them like that. They forbade certain industries from producing for several weeks. So, look great. You could get a blue sky picture. But you can't do that forever. And they don't. And they haven't. But they are aware of the problem. There is an Environmental Protection Agency, and if you look on the books, there is some pretty nice legislation. The problem is that what is said or made policy at the national level has to be implemented at the local level. And you might say, well, certainly it's people at the local level who would say, we're the ones who are experiencing the pollution. We can't drink the water. We can't fish. You'd think they'd be all for this. Well, it's just like Louisiana. Some of the most polluted parts of Louisiana have people who will look the other way. And the reason is because it's polluted because there's industrial development. And these are areas that can make much more money with industry than they can with agriculture. So you're caught. We'll take a short-term loss in pollution in the hope that this big financial gain will get us up to a certain level, and then maybe when we're better off, we can think about cleaning up the rivers and so forth. So there's this problem. If you're poor, maybe you'll take a short-term loss because it's also a short-term gain, and then you hope you will be able to resolve the problem later. However, there's also a problem in that the local government usually gets a large part of its revenue from its industrial part. So there's a big incentive to do economic development, even though you then wind up with a pollution thing. So the government has finally decided, okay, we are going to take this very seriously, and they have actually made pollution reduction a goal for officials to, that's put on, so many points for this, so many points for that, and now you get points for reversing pollution. And these points are relevant because that's how you get promoted up the ladder to more access, to better pay, to maybe a nicer location that's not even polluted. So they are trying to do these things, but there's this real problem These are generally poorer areas. They need economic development, paying a high price. So how do you deal with it? Okay. Non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, have also emerged. It's not just an official environmental protection agency, but there are many private, nonprofit organizations, both international, working in China, as well as domestic. From the environmental point of view, these organizations tend to target maybe not the most important things. I mean, dare I say that? I mean, how can you say what's important? But they tend to be more on save the panda rather than save the villager from the cancer in the water. Part of that is because those are the kinds of organizations that are allowed in. You know, who could be against a panda, right? Even the Chinese like pandas. So, yeah, we can do something like that, protect a species, you know, save some exotic antelope on the Tibetan Plateau. But if you really want to start telling people to, you know, close down factories, that's harder to do, and it's harder to get NGOs to do that. That's seen as politically too dangerous. And for the last several years, under Xi Jinping, the government has cracked down even more on NGOs, particularly foreign NGOs, restricting what they can do or requiring them to be registered so that even if they're not directly restricting you, you self-censor and self-limit what you're going to do because you don't want to get on the wrong side. So lots of problems there. So I hope I've convinced you that at any moment China could, you know, flood, famine, air, water. So yes, they're a big and powerful country, but they're not all there. And then we have population aging, which surely that must be a good thing, right? Here we are, population aging right here. Who could be against it? Well, economists seem to be against it because older people cost money. They get medical care, they get pensions, they get all kinds of weird subsidies. So what do? Well, the Chinese point of view is what you guys in the West did might be good because you, if you see that little quote there, the West developed first and then aged. And it's also the case that in the West, we aged relatively slowly so that you could see what was coming. I mean, the government, in terms of policymakers, could see what was coming and sort of gradually get some pieces in place. China aged first and then developed. Not exactly true, but aged and developed simultaneously, such that it really wasn't possible to have these big pension funds available. And the pension system in China has gotten seriously messed up. Health insurance has gotten seriously messed up, although there have been fixes in the last 5 years. So China has been very concerned with the cost. So let's look at some of these basic statistics. All right, population for China, just comparing China with the US here. So China, the population 65 or older, 10.5%. The US, 15%. Now, if you look at the real numbers though, holy cow, 142 million Chinese over the age of 65 compared with a mere 49 million Americans. It's a lot of people. Life expectancy at birth for males in China, 73.5. Males in the US, 77.5. Life expectancy at birth for females, 77.9 in China, 82.1 in the US. Now, life expectancy at birth is one of those figures that sometimes tells you less than you think. What it really means is it's matching the death rate of a particular year. What's the average age at which people died this year? It is, you know, 77.5 for men, 82.1 for women. If you already get to the age of 65, that doesn't mean you've only got 8 years left, you know. Obviously, life expectancy at 65 could be, in the case of the US, another 20 years. Again, that doesn't mean everybody drops at 85. It means, on average, people 65 will live to 85. Some of them will live to less than 85, half of them, in fact, and half of them will live to more than 85. So you need to watch out for that figure. I mean, it used to drive me crazy. You'd see something like Neanderthals had a life expectancy of 32. That means you were old at 28. No, it means you don't understand statistics. So watch out for that sort of thing. And if you read also, you might read, a particular country has a life expectancy of 55. That doesn't mean there's nobody over 55. That means half the population lives past 55. So just watch out for this tricky number. Okay, the total fertility rate, 1.6 in China. Again, we could talk about how fudged that might be. And in the US, 1.87. Total fertility rate means the total number of children born to women of childbearing age when they have completed their childbearing. Okay? So it doesn't mean, so some people have 0, some people have 1, some people have 2, some people have 4. But the average would be 1.6 and 1.87. So the question is, why did population aging occur so rapidly in China? For 2 reasons. Changes in mortality, changes in fertility. The changes in mortality are pretty straightforward. Better transport, peace. Food can move from one part of the country to another. Food can be grown. Nobody's burning it down and so forth. So people have better nutrition, more varied diet, better able to fend off ordinary infectious disease threats. But when you're weakened, these diseases can take you out, even though normally they would not be fatal. So better nutrition. What else? Better nutrition, better preventive care. China launched major efforts in public health during the Maoist era, and that really made a big difference. And better medical care and access to medical care since prior to 1949. So all of these things contributed to a reduction in mortality, particularly infant mortality. Fertility. Fertility has gone way down, and I'm sure you all know why. Anybody know why? If I raise one finger, OneChild Policy. All right. During Mao's era, up until the early 1970s, while there were people who were concerned with rapid population growth in China, Mao himself was not terribly concerned. It wasn't until the early 1970s that he began to think that this could be a brake, B-R-A-K-E, a brake on economic development. And he argued that maybe we should reduce population growth by emphasizing the benefits to families, and particularly to women, of later marriage, fewer births, and birth spacing. And actually, those 3 policies, if you raise the age of marriage, births out of wedlock are not acceptable. So if you push back the marriage age, you automatically reduce fertility, because people have a shorter period when they're in the game, so to speak. So in the 1970s, those were the policies. And that did result in substantial drop, actually. Most people don't realize this, but it did result in a substantial drop in the fertility rate, but not enough from the point of view of the population experts at that time. And so in 1979, China instituted the One-Child Policy, which I think we've all heard of. All households should have 1 child, only 1 child, girl or boy, that's it. And that did not go over well in the rural areas, particularly. They really wanted to have a boy for reasons that we can get into shortly. And if their first child was a girl, they would go for it. You should still space, but you can have a second child. And I was surprised to discover that people even had 3. And I ran into one family, a rural village, she had 5. And I said, well, is that because the first 4 were girls? And she said, oh no, 3 and 5 were girls. 3 and 5 were boys. So they already had a boy with 3, but they still went for 4 and 5. So, and I said, weren't you in trouble? Wasn't your family in trouble? No. They were ignoring this village, which was like 30 miles outside of Guangzhou or Canton. So, unevenly enforced. In the early years, you heard some very terrible things. And that was the policy. We want to make sure everybody understands we're serious on this policy. I don't care if you're 5 months pregnant. You're pregnant out of time and place. They never would say forced abortion. They always say persuade. We persuade people to have an abortion. And the persuasion can be having you sit up for 24 hours a day, being told how selfish you are, and, everybody's suffering because of you, and maybe you'll be persuaded, or maybe we'll really have to cart you off and have the abortion anyway. So in the first couple of years, there were some really grotesque things going on, which got a lot of coverage, press coverage abroad, certainly in this country. But that slacked off. After a while, it slacked off. And you could fine people for having extra children. That's another way to make money. Fine people for having extra children. So some areas actually, officially, you're not supposed to do this, but if you do, and you can pay for it, bring it on. So, in fact, there are some larger families in rural areas, but not many. And in the city, the one-child policy was really very vigorously enforced. I'm trying to think if I ran into any in my own study. It was unbelievable how many were one-child families. And I finally caught one. This is the grandchildren of the people that I was interviewing. And finally, somebody had 2 grandchildren by the same daughter. And I said, what's this? Twins. So the consequence of this is a rapid rise in the average age of the population. And a higher proportion of the population is elderly than ever before in Chinese history. And different parts of China experience this age differently. Shanghai, for example, is the oldest city in terms of proportion of the population 65 and older. It's like around 20% of the population is 65 or over in Shanghai. So big differences, urban, rural. And I think I better start stepping it up here. Cultural ideals, filial piety, family and household organization. All right, nobody can see this picture, but I'm going to show it anyway. Okay, this is a cover picture of my book, a picture taken by me of a family that was not in my study, but were personal friends. And this is the celebration of this lady's 80th birthday, held in a gigantic fancy hotel with all of her husband, 86 at the time, now 103. And was a big newspaper article on him last year, 103. And when I showed him this book with this picture, you can imagine, he was thrilled. So, but their 9 children, their 9 children-in-law, their uncountable grandchildren, and then, the one's great-grandchildren. This was the ideal. I have another picture, maybe it's in the book somewhere. It was my alternative cover, which has the entire family like on the stage, and it's this one couple and all their descendants. That is, or was, I should say, the Chinese dream. It's over, folks. Can't do that now. And although they had 9 children in Guangzhou, none of them lived with them. None live with them now. Even though they have 5 children in Guangzhou, the children live elsewhere. Instead, they have a distant relative, who may or may not really be a distant relative, from a village, who lives with them and looks after them. She has since passed away. The husband is still around. So let me talk a little bit about what the ideal situation is. The ideal situation, and I'm going to have to make this short because I can see I have planned unwisely on the time distribution here, is in anthropology we talk about different kinds of descent. Who counts as a real member of a family and who doesn't? And in the US, we call it bilateral descent. Your relatives on your father's side, your relatives on your mother's side, they're all the same. I mean, they're the same genetic component. We think of them the same way. What factors into whether we're close to our mother's people or our father's people has to do with location, personal relationships, history, whatever. It's not a cultural requirement that you go one with one or the other. The Chinese traditional system is different. It's a unilineal system. And unilineal systems mean that only one side of the family really counts as the relatives to whom you owe a certain set of obligations and have a certain set of rights in their common good. It could be following the maternal line. There are societies that follow the maternal line, but China follows the paternal line. Your only real relatives are your relatives descended from a common male ancestor. Your sisters are descended from the same ancestor, but your sisters will marry out of the family. They will join another family and become labor power, family caregiver, or whatever to the husband's family. This is the ideal. It has to do with the original fact of being an agricultural society where land was held in common by men and their male relatives, and the women went elsewhere. Now, most people in China today are probably not making their primary income from agriculture, even in rural areas. The country has really, really gone industrial and service sector. But the legacy is there. For example, if you have a lot of money, you can invest equally in sons and daughters. Give them the same level of education. But if you don't have adequate resources, you have to decide what's in the best interest of the family as a whole. And the best interest is to invest in those who are going to be permanent members of the family. So in straitened circumstances, it's the boys who get the education. This is traditional, and not the girls. The girls will get less. In my own study, I don't want to tell you how many of the older women were completely illiterate. None of the men were completely illiterate. Some weren't great readers, but they were not completely illiterate. Almost every man said he could read the paper. Again, the papers are simplified to make sure they grab a large, I don't mean they're written in third grade, not that simplified, but it's not college level text. It's not the New York Times, but excuse me, it's set so that people of, say, middle school level of education would be able to read it. So if you have less education, you have less likelihood of getting a decent job. So women are going to be making less money, and therefore in old age they are less of a resource for you because you don't have pensions. And so the preference is quite practical. It's not that they don't like girls, and in fact recently there has been a shift. I mean, partly due to the one-child family. Whenever you saw signs, posters, we were in China in 1980, right after the one-child family had been implemented, and every big poster that we saw, I mean gigantic posters, you know, one is enough. They had a girl child. It was a girl child. So you be happy with your girl. Girls are good. Women hold up half the sky, and other such phrases. So, I mean, in the urban areas, by and large, women get the same level of education as men. They don't get the same jobs. There's still job diversification, gender-based inhabitants, but they get enough money. And furthermore, you're not really expecting money from your daughter. What you want from your daughter is affection, emotional support. And if a daughter gives you money, she is praised to the sky. Whereas if your son gives you money, he'd better. So, you know, we get off easy. It's sort of like if a mother, you know, helps in the US, you know, wakes up nervously and tends to her little child and all that, that's what she's supposed to do. The dad does it, what a guy. So it's that sort of thing. You're violating, you're going beyond what's the requirement. So anyway, cultural ideals, filial piety, agricultural sons, they should stay with the family farm, the sons should stay together, and then when the old man dies, the property is divided among the sons. Well, you can see after a few generations what's going to happen. You're going to have a piece of land this big. So in effect, you can't keep dividing the land. So eventually, you've either got to buy more land or you've got to diversify and have some of the household members go into other lines of work, peddling, masonry, carpentry, medical, whatever in the village. But the ideal would be an older person is living with their elder son, his wife, and their grandchildren. Okay. And this is because there's very little to provide people with care in terms of the government. I could go into pensions, but I'm out of time. I had a longitudinal study in Guangzhou from 1987 to 1998, where I went back and interviewed the same set of households 3 times, got them first in 87, then went back 4 years later in 91, then went back to the same households in 98, and I also added some new people in 98 because a lot of my previous people had already died. All of these households had at least one person over the age of 70, whom I called my focal elder. And I focused on that person, got all kinds of information from them, on their families and so forth. And one of the things I was particularly interested in was what impact are all of these economic changes in urban China having on the support networks for the elderly. So specifically, I was looking at not financial, I mean, I did look at financial, but I didn't analyze it for this paper. I was interested in who helps with activities of daily living if people, can't do their own shopping, can't walk so far, can't dress, can't this, can't that. And I compared these same households that had a surviving elder up until 98, which wasn't all of them, to find out how care changed. Okay, let me just give you a few figures and then have you speculate as to why it changed. In 1987, 86.5% of my people had all of their daily needs met by a member of the household. That is, somebody that they were living with. 86%. In 1998, that was true for only 48%. What happened? Well, paid care came in. In 1987, 3.8% of households needing assistance drew on paid care. They might also have had a household member helping, but they had some paid care, 3.8%. In 1998, 26% had paid care. And of that 9% of those had only paid care. That is, no family members were contributing. Sometimes there weren't any, but 9%. Also a big change. 1987, there was no one in my study who had needs that were not being met in terms of daily living. We're not talking financial, but in terms of shopping, cooking, eating, blah, blah, blah. In 1998, 7.4% were not having their needs met. So just in the space of 11 years, there was a major change in the way care was being provided to older people. Okay, why? Young people are no good? No. Something you would probably not think of, and it's called housing reform. People lived with family members prior to 1987 and in 1987 because they had to. There wasn't enough housing to go around. Very little housing. So you stayed with your parents. In the middle 90s, China embarked, and Guangzhou was one of the leading cities to do this, embarked on privatizing housing. Most people lived in housing that was provided by the work unit that they were affiliated with. If their work unit, it could be a school, university, hospital, civil service, battery factory, garment industry, whatever. Those outfits were supposed to take care of your housing, provide you with someplace to live. If you worked for a smaller unit that didn't have that kind of economic heft and they couldn't provide you with housing, the Municipal Housing Bureau would assign you to something at minuscule rent. Minuscule rent. I was shocked. People's electric, I mean, to give you a sense of the rationality of pricing, in 1987, people's electric bills were 10 times their rent bill. What? Yes. I don't know what it is now because I haven't interviewed that, but I mean, it was just the pricing system for rent was just completely wacko. Square feet, Didn't matter whether it was luxurious, there wasn't any luxurious housing, but what floor you're on, what local amenities there are, none of this mattered. It was your status within your organization entitled you to a certain number of square feet, and that's what you got. Okay, but with this housing reform, there was an enormous expansion into building housing, and work units went berserk erecting housing and putting their people in it as fast as they could. So what happened was people who were still employed, that is the children, were getting new housing. And then the old folks stayed in that original, $3 a month joint. Now you might say, well, why didn't they go with the old people? Why didn't the old people go with the kids? They would have had to give up everything. These were very stable neighborhoods. You knew your neighbors. You knew the market. You were also in a more compact city at the time. You were close to your doctor. You were close to a park where you participated in various activities. If you moved with your kids, you'd be giving up everything except your kids who worked all day. And some people did move, but only when they had to. Or I shouldn't say only, but usually only when they had to. Most people preferred to stay, this is in my study, in these stable neighborhoods where they knew everybody. Well, if the kids, it's very hard for the kids to come in these great distances. So what do? They hire people. Now there had been hired help even as early as 1987, but it was a particular kind of hired help. It was the kind that I just described for the family where the guy's now 103. You brought in a distant relative from the village and you housed her in your own dwelling because she was not entitled. She didn't work for a work unit, so she wasn't entitled to housing. So you had to have enough space to be able to put somebody up. And most people did not in 1987. But by the time you get to 1998, people have more space. They can put somebody up. But even more importantly, there was a whole new source of caretakers, or caregivers as the word is usually used. And that is, in the middle 1990s, the state business system was completely revamped. Lots of people lost their jobs. And women in particular retired at 50. Retirement age was 50 for women, and they wouldn't get rehired. And so they started to be organized into hourly workers. So now instead of having to have somebody in your house all day, every day, you could contract to have somebody come in and once a day, for 2 hours, fix your meal, get you out of bed. Or you could have somebody who would shop for you once a week, twice a week, 3 times, whatever. So these hourly workers became a whole new source of labor. So this has been the source of major, major changes in how care is being delivered in China. And I was going to go into this in great detail, but I won't. In 2013, there was a very popular TV serial, 14 episodes, called Lau Yo Yi, which China's outstanding drama, it says right here. And it details every problem that families have in looking after elders. It's very sympathetic to older people, and it shows you everything. Older people are looking after older people. You have a 60-year-old looking after an 85-year-old. How does that work out? You have exploitative relatives who think, if I look after this old guy in the village, I will inherit his property, whatever it might be. But they don't really want to care for you. They just want the property. You have people who are living with a child, but the child works all day in a very demanding job. And when she, in this case, comes home, she doesn't have the energy to look after you. And so you feel abandoned even while you're living with your child. And more terrible tales. The ending, you got the solution right there. I think I wrote it down. Love in the golden years, and life in a warm neighborhood like retirement home, where one can continue to contribute and be appreciated by one's peers. So the ideal in this serial is not living with your family. The Chinese are being told right on their TV screens that it's too much for families now. They should be allowed to move to low cost, there's a problem there, dwellings with other older people where they can help each other out do exercises together, and so forth, and everybody will be happy. So, in the end, these two marry. Love in the golden years. These two marry. Yes?
I have a question. Do you think a one-child policy is added to this sum too?
Sure, because there's no way to share the care if you've got only one child. Yes. In fact, when they initially started the one-child policy, they knew people would be worried about that. Hey, there's only one child. What if it's a girl? And they promised that there would be benefits. But that kind of, they did get little benefits at the beginning, but they were benefits for the kid to get good placement in school. And then once it was enforced by everybody, then it was no longer a special benefit. So, yeah, of course, the one child. I mean, children get jobs in other parts of the country. What do you do? So, yes, that's definitely one of the consequences. Okay, now, very quickly, territorial integrity. China has many concerns about its territory, particularly this area, Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Okay, so I got it right here. If you have a colored one, it's the green right here, Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. They are Turkic Muslims. So they're ethnically and racially, if you can use that term these days, they don't look the same as Han Chinese. They look more European. But they are a Turkic population, and they've been there forever and ever. The Chinese have been there too for a long time, but in very small numbers, primarily in a military capacity. But since the 1950s, more and more Chinese have moved into that area, initially primarily military, and then people who have been released from the military would settle there on collective farms. And it's an area that, as a minority area with ties across the border, the same ethnic population is over here in the former Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, over in this area. And those people are used to crossing, well, they were used to crossing the border freely. They were disregarded, you know, they didn't see themselves as members of a nation state. They moved freely back and forth. And the Soviet Union in the 1940s tried to help that area get free of China. And in 1946, I think, no, 1944 to, well, in the middle 1940s, oh, it says right there, 1944 to 1949, it encouraged this area to become an independent state called the East Turkestan Republic. So it was briefly independent of China. And then in 1949, China demanded it back and got it back just by military force. And so there's been an active separatist movement there for basically ever since. I mean, I've been there and there were signs saying, you know, support the motherland, do not yield to separatists, blah, blah, blah. So, you know, it is a dangerous area. Prior to 2001, the U.S. was kind of sympathetic to these minorities and was saying China was too harsh and so on and so forth. But then the Chinese got lucky because with 9/11, you know, we weren't so sympathetic to Islamic militants. And so the Chinese said, oh, you know, those Uyghurs, they're a terrorist group. So now we have agreed that they're a terrorist group, so we don't talk about them so much. So the external powers have, or activities have impinged on this. But they do occasionally, the Uyghurs, do occasionally show up and commit a terrorist act, blow up a bus, attack people with knives in a railway station, miles and miles away in totally different provinces. So there's a lot of tension there. So, you know, they're always worried, the Chinese are always worried about the border area. I mean, is that going to be a way for people to infiltrate into China? Or are border peoples going to go over? Their argument is they would like to have their religious leader, the Dalai Lama, back and that they would like to see their culture preserved. Now, you'll notice in the sheet there I put Tibet. Xizang is what's on your map for Tibet there. There's the Tibetan Autonomous Region, or TAR, which is what we associate with the Dalai Lama. But there are many Tibetans in China outside of the TAR. That is, there are autonomous counties in provinces all around there. In this if this is Tibet, or what says Xizang on your paper, if that's Tibet, these areas are also lots of Tibetans. And what the Chinese are afraid of, the Chinese government, is that, sure, you only want the TAR, but once you get the Dalai Lama back here, you will start agitating for all those other Tibetans to come and join you. And we don't want that. We don't want all these other provinces disrupted and so on and so forth. So they've been very unsympathetic to Tibet on that score. I can do more on that later. Taiwan, Republic of China, as you know, our new president accepted a phone call, a congratulatory phone call from the president of the Republic of Taiwan, which got everybody hot and bothered, possibly unnecessarily. The Chinese government, I mean, they will say things and bark, but they will say behind the scenes that things don't really bother them as much as we might think. I mean, the official government won't say that, but other people will say it. Let me just give you a small example of how the game is played. You may or may not know that Massachusetts has a sister province relationship with Guangdong province. So every so often, Guangdong province will send a delegation to Massachusetts. And my husband is on the, I don't know what, was on the sister province committee at one point. So this meant that I, too, would host some of these committees. And so one day we're with this group in their little charter bus, and the governor, we're going to go to a certain place in Boston, but to get from point A to point B, we would have to pass the World Trade Center in Boston. And you might say, so what's the big deal? The big deal is the World Trade Center is decorated with flags of all nations that we have a trading relationship with, including the Republic of China. That's Taiwan. And they shouldn't have, I mean, from the Chinese point of view, they're not supposed to have their own flag. They're not independent. They're part of us. But they also understand that it's de facto independent, almost de facto independent. So I'm sitting on this bus, and all of these Guangdong people are sitting there, and one of them turns to the others and says, we're taking a really roundabout route to get where we're going. And he knew why. He said, do you know why? He said, because they don't want us to see the Taiwan flag. And so everybody had a good laugh. And then they realized that I understood what they were saying, which we all laughed. But the point is, they were willing to tolerate it. They were not going to stand up and say, oh, we can't come to Boston because you've got the Taiwan flag there. I mean, so you ignore a lot. But you don't ignore Taiwan efforts to move to independence. And I've forgotten when, but about 10 years ago, I guess, there was a change in political party rulership, and the new party began to agitate and talk about independence, and that got the U.S. scared witless, because we've pledged to protect them if the mainland Chinese were to say, you can't separate like that, we're going to use military force. The Shanghai Communique, which was promulgated in 1972 and was the result of negotiations between Nixon and Zhou Enlai and other leadership in China, was that we would agree that Taiwan was a part of China and leave it at that. So, just live with it. Don't do anything about it. Just let the Taiwan people have their party and let the mainland have theirs. And as long as nobody tries to force the other party to do something you know, we can live with it. Just the economic integration between Taiwan and the mainland is unbelievable. Here's Taiwan. Here's the adjacent province of Fujian. Tremendous ties. I mean, even a lot of the businessmen, they have their Taiwan wife and their Fujian wife. One in each country. Oh, but it's only one country. So there are all kinds of things going on economically. And the United States also became very upset with this independence movement. And while we talked, you know, agreeably, officially, we sent a lot of people behind the scenes to say, we do not want you to drag us into a war with China. So do think about cooling it. So they've been quiet on that front. Now, some people can get elected claiming they're going to agitate, but so far it's been pretty quiet since that initial flurry maybe 10 years ago. So they both agree they're one country. If you look at Chinese maps, it includes Taiwan. I don't know if you look at Taiwan maps if it includes China. Have to look at that. Okay, other international concerns. The South China Sea. South China Sea is down here. It's practically falling off the map. South China Sea. And then the East China Sea over here. These are disputes about islands. They're really not so much disputes about islands as they are disputes about the water. And if you can claim you own the island, then you can say it's part of your international territory, and therefore it's subject to the 12-mile territorial integrity boundary and even the 200-mile economic zone boundary. And China has been aggressively moving in the South China Sea to create islands. That is, to build on what are shoals or even reefs. You know, they're not above water when it's high tide, and they're not capable of sustaining human habitation, but they're putting a military installation or this or that or the other thing on these and trying to assert that these are islands and they're ours. And last summer, the Philippines, who are very close to all this, the Philippines just peeking up out of the corner here, Philippines just barely in the corner, they took China to the, what was it called? The Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, because China was claiming one of these new islands and said, you can't claim that, you have no right to claim that, it's very close to the Philippines. And the court decided in favor of the Philippines. Chinese claims to this land are invalid, and this is international law, and China has said, oh, we beg to disagree. We don't believe it. So they have so far rejected, but they haven't acted particularly on it. And the US has reserved the right to demonstrate freedom of navigation. If China claims the whole South China Sea, then in theory they control maritime traffic through that area because it would be part of China. And a huge amount of trade goes through that area, Japan, Korea, whatnot, Taiwan, and certainly China itself. But they have, we have gone in with our ships and sailed through there, and the Chinese have looked angry, and I think, didn't we lose something over the side recently? And they recovered it, some kind of ball-like sensing instrument, and the Chinese gave it back graciously, probably after decoding it, but nevertheless, they gave it back. And they didn't get into a big spat. But the big concern is that you'll get somebody who wants to be Top Gun and, you know, independently acts and does something reckless, and then where will it all go?